Welcome to Choose Your Own Adventure, Econ, or Economics for the Imagination. My name is Jaffa Applegate, and I do economics at Arizona State University School of Complex Adaptive Systems. Where to start? My starting point is with the late David Graeber. And paraphrasing Graeber, the purpose of an economy is the production of self-actualized people embedded in meaningful social contexts. Therefore, we take the household as the base unit of the economy. We'll start with the basic structure of economies and then look at how options can be applied to this structural framework. But first, let's talk a little bit about the formation of an economy. Narratives determine the goals and values that guide mechanism, design, and selection. The economy is the set of all mechanisms that determine the outcomes of economic interactions. And how a society chooses and combines mechanisms depends on the goals and the desired outcomes. One more piece. This is a work in progress, so there's still some questions about this framing. First of all, to what degree can these mechanisms be considered modular? How do novel mechanisms arise and evolve? And finally, are there general CAS principles that can be used to predict mechanism outcomes and to guide in the selection of mechanisms? And here, CAS means complex adaptive system science. Okay, let's look at the proposed framework. To start, we're going to look at natural resources that go through some sort of production process and end up being consumed. Here we're defining production as the transformation of natural resources into goods ultimately consumed by households. But of course, this gets complicated very quickly. Production can be classified as intermediate or final, where intermediate production describes consumption by productive activities themselves, whereas final consumption refers to consumption by households. Each of these three aspects of an economy are governed by mechanisms. Let's examine those mechanisms, starting with natural resources. When considering resources, we consider management and allocation questions. All this basically comes down to ownership. My preferred vision of ownership is known as the bundle of sticks, where each stick is considered a particular right, and ownership can imply maybe some set of rights and not other set of rights, but that the individual rights which comprise of ownership are actually socially determined. When thinking about ownership, because households are a base unit, ownership can be done by households. It could be done by the state, which could be considered all households, or various subsets of multiple households, whether they be commons or shareholders, or even workers. Appropriation, or ownership, implies exclusion, which means in most of this conversation, we're going to be considering ownership, meaning the ability to exclude access of a good or resource to others. Now we're going to move on to production, and we're going to look at production in three parts. First of all, let's talk about division of labor returns. Cooperative human production is phenomenal in that you have this mystery of returns to division of labor. So If you and I are working on producing something and we work in parallel, which means I'm making the whole thing from end to end, you're making the whole thing from end to end, we have a given output. However, if we divide the work in such a way that we work in series, which I produce some parts of the final product, you produce some parts of the final product, we actually end up producing more than we would have produced on our own. It's actually a kind of magic. But the important part about division of labor of returns is that you need to figure out what happens to them. So if we're producing more together for the same amount of time, that surplus could go a variety of different places, such as increasing our own wages, or decreasing the price, or we could have it as profit, or we could vest it back into our production process and maybe buy some tools or do more division of labor to increase returns. Or it could go to a common pool where the community decides what happens to this money. This is what happens with the Benedictine monks. Or everyone could work less, which is what Keynes had suggested in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Something very curious, however, is that division of labor returns don't seem to manifest for pure service work. Let's look at the second aspect of production. So workers use tools to transform resources into products. Well, this brings up a whole lot of questions, because the tools are also products known as capital goods. Let's look at this in terms of ownership. Remember, ownership fundamentally can be defined as households or subsets of households. So who owns the inputs to production? Who owns the tools? And who owns the outputs of production? We also need to consider the disposal of byproducts. Who owns the waste from the production process? This is often neglected. Let's look at our third phase of production. Let's talk about the management of production processes, which could be considered the ownership of the production process. Again, it could be done by workers. Production could be managed by managers, which are another subset of households, just like workers are. Or it could be managed by owners, which may be one or more households. Or it could be managed by the state. So the three aspects we considered for production were: who owns the returns to the division of labor, who owns the factors of the production and the inputs and the outputs, and finally, who manages the production process. Let's look at allocation or procurement for consumption. Okay, remember, consumption needed unpacking. So if you consume a natural resource that doesn't go through any production methods, that's known as primary consumption. There's also intermediate consumption, which is considered consumption by the production process. And there's final consumption, which is consumption by households. We had talked about this before in terms of production, but consumption, the same labels apply. Now there's methods for allocation. You can do exchange, or households could own shares. You could have a command allocation system. If you're talking about exchange, your options are markets. And markets all have structures. An auction market is very different from a posted price market. And there's almost an infinite number of ways you can combine mechanisms for auction markets. The markets also need a medium of exchange. This could be monetary or it could be credit. The exchange could also be in the form of gifting or barter. Barter requires the double coincidence of wants, so therefore we don't actually see it in day-to-day exchange anywhere in the world. If barter does show up, it's usually one-off situations like kids exchanging things in elementary school, or you actually see it when two tribes meet, for example, and they actually set up the event where one tribe is bringing goods, another tribe is bringing their goods, and they do an exchange at that moment in time. So this distribution process involves questions of transport, storage, and depots. So there you have it, the three main aspects of an economy and the different ways you could set up mechanisms to address the needs specific to each of those areas. Here's a couple of other considerations. First, you need to maintain your mechanisms. So this is going to involve questions such as, who makes the rules? Who enforces the rules? So who monitors? How does monitoring happen? And how do sanctions happen? Are you actually going to expel defectors? Who can change the rules? And who settles disputes? And we can't really claim to be talking about economics without discussing money. Something, by the way, neoclassical economists never do. There are three main aspects or purposes of money. One is a medium of exchange. Two is a store of value. And three is a unit of account. Something that's important to think about in monetary systems is that credit is necessary, but it needs constraint. The amount of credit in a system determines the size of the transactions that can be conducted. So if you want to conduct large transactions, you need to have a credit mechanism. However, wild money blows up the system, so you need to be careful and monitor and constrain that credit mechanism. Essentially, narratives determine values which determine goals. And all of this together informs the decisions made by owners. Therefore, ownership implies agency. Let's exercise our framework by examining a few economic tropes. Let's start with capitalism. So in our first set, resources are owned by subsets of households. We're going to call this private ownership. That takes care of our first aspect. Second aspect, production. We look at the division of labor, which is profit, which goes to owners, also known as shareholders, but again, private ownership to a subset of households. The production tools, inputs, and outputs are also owned by owners or shareholders. Notice there's nothing here about disposal of waste. The neoclassical framing contains an assumption known as free disposal, which means any residues from the production process just magically vanish. I kid you not. And the management of production normally is done by a management class. Once again, a subset of households. Our third aspect, allocation, is usually conducted through a monetary exchange system, though it's very heavily credit-based. Let's look at another economic trope, communism. Here, resources are owned by the state, which could signify all households or a subset of households that equals the party. And that's our first element. Now we have division of labor, the returns of which go to the state, normally applied to price reduction. The production tools, inputs, and outputs are also owned by the state. Management of production is, you've got it, the state. And the allocation is by command, at the command of the state. I hope you can see by examining these two tropes how the framework that we have constructed offers a selection of multiple mechanisms which will lead to different outcomes. Nuances abound, and there could be infinite mechanisms because new ones can be created or devised. Some combinations of mechanisms will obviously be incentive incompatible, but others may work together in surprisingly effective ways. So what about services? Services seem to me to be a matter of contracting, and artisans actually are a good example of services as well. And the things that these have in common is that there's no division of labor production. So an artisan works singly owns her own tools. So very much if you get something from an artisan, it's a contracting relationship, much as you would get a masseuse or maybe a house cleaner. Sometimes you can get a house cleaner from an agency, and the agency may charge a fee, but that's not a division of labor profit. That's simply a fee for the additional service of taking care of the hiring, vetting, and contracting so that you don't have to do that. What about arts and culture? This is a good one. I like to think about it in terms of the university model, where we are paid a living and not paid piecework. This could also apply to healthcare, education. And what about land ownership? This is very problematic and needs examination, but lots of people are considering a stewardship model. In conclusion, a well-functioning economic system will be mostly invisible, but it will order the lives of your characters.